For the last few weeks, we've been looking at some times when our faith doesn't make sense, when our faith doesn't quite work well for us. And so we started off with the story of the rich ruler who goes to Jesus and says, "What do I need to do to inherit eternal life?" And he was kind of operating from a place where he was rich, he had all this stuff, and he thought that because he had a lot of stuff, that meant that God loved him more than God loved other people who didn't have as much stuff. So his faith got challenged by Jesus. His faith really wasn't working. It wasn't really representing reality, and he had to do a turn. He had to do a big turn to come into a deeper connection with God. And then the next week, we talked a little bit about doubts. How doubts can be a barrier. Doubts can be a barrier for us, and they can make us struggle with our faith. But using that famous doubter, who's the most famous doubter?
Thomas.
Oh, you're good today. You're good today. It must be because we're outside. Thomas doubted, but Thomas was actually the one that through his doubts came to the deepest faith, came to the deepest recognition of who Jesus really is. And today, it's what happens to our faith in the face of death. Mary and Martha, their brother Lazarus died. And see, they knew Jesus. I mean, Jesus was really close to them. You know, if you read the Gospels, you can argue that God's favorite place on earth was Bethany, in the home of Mary and Martha and Lazarus. That's where Jesus was most at home. A very, very special relationship with these people. And so it must have been really hard. It must have been really hard for Mary and Martha. They send word to Jesus. I mean, they've seen Jesus heal people. They've seen him do miracles. They've seen him break the system. Where is he? And their brother dies. Lazarus dies. And sometimes when we read this text, we might get the impression that, well, God has a plan. I mean, doesn't it read like that? Doesn't it read like Jesus gets word that Lazarus is dying and he says to the disciples, you know, this isn't terrible because through his death, God will be glorified. There's a plan here. There's a plan, and God will be glorified. And we can interpret that to say, well, there's always a plan that'll make sense in the end. But I'm not so sure about that. I'm not so sure that the answer is that simple, that the answer is that direct. And here's why. Because when Jesus comes back to Mary and Martha, and they meet him, they both say the same thing, right? They both say, "Lord, if you would have been here, my brother wouldn't have died." And we could take that almost as an accusation, as, where were you? He's dead. If you would have been here, this wouldn't have happened. I thought you loved us. Why weren't you here? But if you read a little bit further, it does say, you know, they say, "Lord, but we believe. We believe. We believe that even now, God will give you whatever you want. And we know that on the last day, our brother will live again." So they have that confidence. So it's not really for their sake that this has happened. Their faith is pretty solid already. And the other thing is when Jesus shows up, when he sees the grief of Mary and Martha and all the people that are gathered there, when he sees their grief, when he sees their pain, he doesn't say, "Hey, stop crying, I got this handled. What are you crying for? I'm here now. I'm taking care of things." Jesus weeps. Jesus looks at the pain that these people have, and he weeps too. That situation grieves him too. You know, you read the text, it's not like, well, he was a little bit sad, but he was deeply moved. His insides were turned upside down, is basically what the text says. His insides were turned upside down because he was so grieved at the death of his friend and at the grief of the other people that he loved. And see, this is the same Jesus. He knows what's going to happen, right? He knows that in just a few minutes he's going to raise Lazarus from the dead. But the pain for him is still real. It still hurts Jesus. God weeps when we weep. It's like that text from 2 Peter where it says, but don't forget that with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. And a lot of times in that text we grab onto the second half and say, our suffering might seem long. It might seem like we have all these years of suffering on earth, but in God's picture, in the picture of eternity, all of this, our 70, 80, 90, 115 years of life, it's like a day. It's like that. And I think that's something good to hold on to. It's good to hold on to the idea that, as Paul says, that the glories that will be revealed in us cannot be compared to the sufferings of the present time. That there is something beautiful and amazing waiting for us. But I think that first half, that with the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years. A day is like 1,000 years from God's perspective. So that day when you were grieving, that one day that you were grieving, God was with you, and for God, that was like 1,000 years of grief. Because God was feeling your pain. God was weeping alongside you. And I think that that's the thing that we can fall back on. We cannot always fall back on the idea that Jesus could break the system and make a miracle. Because, I don't know if you've noticed, but miracles don't happen all the time. It's part of the way the world works. That's why they're miracles, because they don't happen all the time. But see, when the miracle doesn't happen, when death isn't reversed, when the person doesn't get better, Jesus still shows up. God still shows up and weeps with us. He's there to comfort us. He's there to give us his strength. And that makes a profound difference. When I was in Shishmaref, that little island south of the Arctic Circle up there in northwest Alaska, there was a day when a child got sick. And nobody could figure out what was going on. Some of you know this story. Couldn't wake her up. Couldn't wake up. Down at the little clinic, called a plane in for medevac, but it was whiteout. And whiteout means that from me to Mr. Rabus, you can't see. I mean, you literally can't see 2 feet in front of you. They still sent the plane, hoping that they might be able to land. And the plane came overhead. The sky cleared. You could see 30 miles. Plane landed, picked up the kid, flew off, took her to the hospital. 5 minutes later, whiteout again. Couldn't see 2 feet. She made it to the hospital. She was treated. She got better. Now, does that sound like a miracle? Yeah. I mean, that sounds like, a bona fide call Pope Francis. It's a miracle. And it was great. It was amazing. A couple years after that, another child got sick. Was down at the clinic. It wasn't whiteout. The sky was clear, so they called the plane. The plane came in, rushed her off to Anchorage, put her in intensive care, and she died. And that was tragic. That was tragic for the whole village. But we came together and we wept together. And Jesus wept with us. And people were sustained. And people were strengthened. And people continued to live knowing that even when the miracle doesn't happen, God is still there. That God is still real. And that we still look forward to that day, just like Mary and Martha did. We still look forward to that day when Jesus will raise us all back up to life, where it really will be better than we have ever imagined. But in the meantime, God does not leave us alone. God does not abandon us even in those hardest times, when our faith is most tested. When we are weeping, we can take heart because Jesus weeps with us. Thanks be to God.